A recent study released by the Reuters Institute called The Trust Gap looks at the relationship between trust in news and how people think about news on digital platforms, mainly focusing on Facebook, Google, WhatsApp, and YouTube. The study is based on survey data from Brazil, India, UK, and the United States. We are joined by Dr. Camila Mont'Alverne, who is one of the authors of the report, and Pratik Sinha, the founder of Alt News and a pioneer in debunking fake news. Dr. Camila Mont'Alverne is one of the authors and also a postdoctoral research fellow who works on the Trust in News project. Dr. Camila and Pratik, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
I'll start by asking you, Dr. Camila, one of the key findings of your report is how news on digital platforms is trusted less than news in general. So can you elaborate on what exactly were the reasons shared by the people who you interviewed largely and especially in India?
So first, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to discuss this here with you two today. And I think you are correct in summarizing that this is the main finding of our report, that we find a gap between levels of trust people have in general and levels of trust in news on digital platforms. We can say that this gap is consistent among platforms and among the 4 countries that we are studying, but this does not mean that people have negative feelings towards the platform. What we found is that people have higher levels of trust in news in general when compared with the levels of trust that they have on digital platforms, but this doesn't mean that they don't think that platforms are useful or that they have strongly negative feelings about them. So one important thing to have in mind is that many of the same people that lack trust in news in digital platforms, they are also the ones that express that they have less trust in news in general. So one possibility for that is that this is an expression of the satisfaction with the quality of information that people find on platforms, or a consequence of the discussions around these issues and how people are concerned about that. And people, I would say that because our results also show that people across all countries are concerned about what they see as false or as misleading information in the platform.
Dr. Camila, your report says that 50% of people that said that they trusted news they received on WhatsApp. Why do you think Indians tend to trust WhatsApp forward so easily? And is there any data that reflects the amount of unverified news floated through WhatsApp in India?
I'm not sure if there is data about unverified news in India, but you are you are correct in saying that India is one of the countries where most people say that they trust news on WhatsApp. And I think there are some reasons for that. One very important one is the familiarity people have with WhatsApp. When you look for the data in India, we see that 56% of respondents from India said that they use WhatsApp in the past 30 days, and 46% said that they use it to get news every day. But for me, the main two elements are around familiarity, as I mentioned, and also a feeling that WhatsApp is something that is useful for them and that they have good reasons to be there. And I think the only part that I would be a bit more cautious about is in saying that people trust easily what they receive on WhatsApp. And in general, they are younger people that are more educated and more interested in politics.
Interesting data here, Pratik. I want to ask you, with cheap internet data available on smartphones and technological advancement, and of course the scale of fake news floating across platforms, what do you think makes users more vulnerable to the information they receive online?
I think the vulnerability lies more in the education system, where we have not been taught how to think critically towards information we receive. There is absolutely no education towards digital literacy. There in India, there has been an enormous push towards making everything digital without any attempt to introduce digital literacy into people's lives. And especially, so there are two things. One is cheap data, next is cheap smartphones, the Chinese smartphones and the influx of it that has come into this country. And from my experience, the rumor mongering does not end at somebody who owns a smartphone. Let's say if you're in a village where there's a lot of poverty, and let's say a very limited number of people own smartphones, but the rumor mongering then takes the form of word of mouth and goes beyond. And that is where we see the child kidnapping rumors, and how devastating they have been, where people have been lynched, people have been killed, people have been maimed, because on WhatsApp there is quote unquote news flowing, claiming that your child is going to get kidnapped, your child is going to, their our organs are going to get trafficked. So that is the classic case of how people view WhatsApp. That is, they think it is so real that they internalize it, and it forms a part of their fear psyche. So at least in my experience of the past 5 years working on misinformation and disinformation, what I have seen is that people in India are very gullible to propaganda. Now, I don't think there's this. If even if there's one study I'm not aware of, but what makes people in one country more gullible to propaganda than another country? That is a question that needs to be answered. But in India, there are several factors. Number one, uh, we have highly polarizing political debates. Our mainstream media has highly polarizing political debates. So this, whatever the gullibility of people in general is propagated by mainstream media as well, where a large section of the mainstream media speaks in one voice, and they speak the voice of the propaganda. It is as if the US has one Fox News and India has almost every channel in India is a Fox News. So when you have so many important voices speaking the voice of propaganda, then it almost destroys the ability of people to think critically, because then all they get is propaganda. That is one big issue in India. These two are main issues in my opinion. That is the role of mainstream media in India, especially TV channels, TV news channels, and second, the absolute lack of digital literacy, which is making people extremely vulnerable to any sort of malinformation, misinformation.
Data suggests that there are over 450 million people in India who use WhatsApp, and this is from early 2022. So you being somebody who's a founder of Alt News and have been debunking fake news for a while now, and you're probably the pioneers in India. How do you think fact-checking organizations can keep up to fight misinformation? Considering the high volume of fake news being circulated.
Fact checking is not a solution to misinformation. What we see in the society today, there are many underlying reasons. As I said, lack of digital literacy is one big reason. Unless you solve that issue, we can keep writing 1,000 fact checks, a year, but nothing is going to change. And we have seen that the realization that we have come to is that fact checking has a very limited scope. That is to raise awareness about the issue, which I think Alt News has played a significant part, at least in India, to raise awareness about the issue that misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech are a big issue in India. I'll give you a quick example. When I think 3 years ago in Kerala, there was a rumor against a vaccine, the measles rubella vaccine, MR vaccine, claiming that the MR vaccine is mixed with a component which will make people infertile, those who take the vaccine. And suddenly there was a huge drop in the number of people taking the vaccine. Now, people reported on it that the vaccine rates have dropped from 90%, vaccination rates have dropped from 90% to 50%, but just reporting it did not solve the issue. Eventually, the administration swung into action, and this was in Kannur district, and they did district-wide, across the district, they did workshops inviting both children as well as parents, and told them, how to trust information, how not to trust information, what are the questions you should ask when you look at sources of information, and that sort of program immediately brought the vaccination rates back to 90%. So what I'm saying is that journalism, while is very important, is not going to solve the issue that we face today. And this has been seen again and again. About 4 years ago in Telangana, when the child kidnapping rumors were going on. And Kerala has a much higher literacy rate than Telangana. Telangana has a very low literacy rate. So it is not that, in Kerala, you can do workshops where people can sit in a classroom, see something that's on a board and read and understand. In Telangana, because there's very little literacy, you cannot have those kind of workshops. So there's this IPS officer, her name is Rema Rajeshwari. She conducted street plays to bring awareness, and then the child kidnapping rumor stopped. So what I'm saying is that this expectation that fact checking is going to solve the issue of misinformation is a wrong expectation, and more people need to realize that, because otherwise we are looking in the wrong place for a solution.
Dr. Camila, your study also says that 70% of those who held a favorable opinion about Prime Minister Modi said that they trust news on WhatsApp, as compared to 58% of those who held unfavorable opinions about him. You have been researching on this topic for some time now. Globally, Dr. Camila, what are the examples of populist leaders influencing news, and how do they make people believe that news they don't like and critical of their policies or ideology is fake?
I think this is a very crucial point in almost all democracies, or the main democracies in the world at this point in that we live in. In India, usually, as you cited the results for WhatsApp, but we also have previous data that also shows that people who support the Prime Minister Modi are more likely to trust news in India. And I'm not an expert on the India context, but I would agree with Pratik's explanation about the content that in India that most Indian TV channels offer, and how this might really be related with the evaluations partisan people do about it. If we compare with the United States and with the UK and with Brazil, the impacts of these leaders are somewhat different. In the UK, also those who tend to support Boris Johnson at the time that he was in power also had slightly better, higher levels of trusting news. And this might be a trait of a media system that sometimes tends to favor mainstream positions, and therefore tends to offer more visibility to whoever is in government. In the UK, we see in the US, we see that people that support Donald Trump, as expected, have much lower levels of trusting news. And in Brazil, it follows the same pattern as the US. People who support Bolsonaro also tend to have lower levels of trusting news. I think, especially in the cases of Brazil and the US, we see a relationship that it's not exactly of accommodation of the media or of several parts of the traditional media with these populist leaders, but more that they tend to attack the media and make journalists and news organizations as one of their targets. And I think this is very effective in making their supporters being less trusting of news organizations, and in some cases even feeling that they are empowered enough to constrain journalists, to attack them, sometimes physically on streets. So we have seen impacts that are very, very severe, I would say, in many of these countries. And I think, as far as I know of the Indian context, things are not very bright for opposition or even not necessarily oppositional journalists, but journalists that are not completely aligned with the government. So I think we have a global trend in some of these democracies that have been working similarly when we look at populist leaders.
Anurag Thakur, the INB minister, he had recently said that the government respects freedom of speech. But strongest action will be taken against those who become a threat to the country's sovereignty and integrity. The government also blocked some over 40 videos from YouTube and 16 YouTube channels, including, I think, 6 channels from Pakistan. Your colleague Zubair was arrested for allegedly hurting religious sentiments for a tweet he had posted, of course, released later. The larger question, Pratik, is how do you think journalists and fact checking can ensure governments don't misuse calls for regulation to, silence critics?
In India, there's very little independent media anymore. There are very few organizations which can claim to be independent, especially because the funding sources are not independent. That is the primary problem in India, that the money that funds media organizations is from big corporates, and big corporates are controlled by the government. When we talk about journalists as a clan in India, there is one group of journalists which is trying to question the government, but there's the larger group of journalists are not in a position, even if they wish to question the government. So, can journalists keep the government accountable? I don't think the answer there is a positive answer. In situations, my understanding is that in situations like this, eventually the civil society has to realize that what the government is doing is, and they also have to swing in action. It is not just a small bunch of independent journalists who can question the government. When these 40 videos were taken and certain channels were banned, we looked into the videos that were taken down, and we did find misinformation in those videos. But could can that misinformation sort of threaten the sovereignty of the country? I don't think so. And most of those misinformation was targeting the government and the political party in power. It was not targeting the sovereignty of the government. And all the misinformation which was in favor of the government, none of that was taken down. Only specific kind of misinformation claiming that it's threatening the sovereignty of the country was taken down, because it was misinformation which was going against the government. So that was a very selective approach of and they did not even ban those videos. What they did was they made it unavailable in India. So if you have a non-Indian IP address, you can still view those channels and view those videos. So if it was indeed the case of misinformation, then they could have approached YouTube, as because YouTube also has a misinformation policy. And they could have taken that route, that is, look, these videos have misinformation. Instead, what the route they chose to take was one of censorship, not one where this is misinformation, and there should be a misinformation policy. So the problem now is that the government there's propaganda from all sides. I'm not saying that this misinformation is okay or that misinformation is okay. There's propaganda from all sides, and plus YouTube has become a platform through which a lot of YouTubers in India are making money. So the incentive is not always political. There's also a hugely financial incentive, because the more right now, in fact, we have an article in working as we speak, which may be published in a day or two, about how one particular channel is specializing in anti-government misinformation, and it is clear that because the misinformation is so bizarre, that it is clear that the motive is clickbait, and the motive is to make money through these videos. Whatever the minister has said is, number one, untrue. It is not misinformation. That it is not information just targeting sovereignty. Plus, it is a very, very selective approach, and that is what is dangerous. That is, they are not looking at misinformation as a policy, but they are using the government apparatus to safeguard political interests of a particular political party that is ruling the country.
Dr. Camila, another important statistic from your report is how 58% people believe that most journalists manipulate the public to serve the agenda of the powerful. And while 57% believe that journalists care more about getting attention than reporting facts. What do you think are the reasons behind this, and how do you think that this reflects in the larger context for any country?
So I think one first important thing to mention there is that these negative perceptions about journalists, they are generally widespread across the 4 countries, and that social media is one of the most cited often cited places where people say that they see or that they hear criticism of news and journalism. So we have a context in which, in the case of India, almost 60% of the population say things like they believe that journalists try to manipulate audiences to serve agendas of powerful politicians. And in many cases, the places that they say they have access to these kinds of to these critiques or these claims about what journalism does is on social media. I think it's also important to get in specifically in the India context that although we see lots of people saying that they often encounter criticism of the news media in platforms, a substantial amount of people say that they find this criticism when they are talking to other people. So 52% said that they heard these critiques about journalists from ordinary people, and 36% from friends, which I think gives us an idea of how this kind of perception is widespread in people's daily lives. If they not necessarily talk about this every day, they are exposed to that in their regular conversations. And I think this puts a specific challenge to try to for journalists and for news organizations to try to get closer to people and to create a more trusting relationship and to sometimes try to change ideas that they have already very established about how journalism works. It's also important to say that not necessarily the critiques that people have about journalists are not justified. And this is another thing that we don't have a way to measure in our study. But in some cases, if you have a media environment in which most of the options that are there for people to access are not the most trustworthy ones, maybe it's not bad that people have negative perceptions or that people make distinctions among them. The problem is that it's not clear that people are able to do these distinctions between what is a trustworthy source and what is not. And what we have found is that when in these cases when people are face the situation in which they don't know if they can trust something because they either don't have any connection or they are predisposed to not trust news in general, they just choose to not trust anything, which can be problematic since we don't know exactly in which they will rely to get their information. I also think still around this point of criticism and negative perception, I also think that it's important to mention how in India, how important politicians are as a relevant source of criticism in India. 29% said that they hear criticism coming from politicians. So there is a combination of a discourse that is present in people's daily lives when they talk to other people, but also a kind of discourse and some certain hostility towards the media that can also come from politics and from attacks that they do to journalists and news organizations. So the combination of these two things seems to be very important to explain that.
Pratik, the Reuters report says that large majorities in all 4 countries which they've surveyed, including data from India, they agree that false and misleading information, harassment, and platforms using data irresponsibly are a big problem in their countries for like many tech platforms. So, in your opinion, how do you think that we can combat this, and should big tech be doing more?
Big tech should be doing a lot more, and big tech works very differently in, let's say, US and India. In the US, for example, even if there is a state election, then Facebook will put out an official press release saying what are the measures it is taking to ensure that the election is not compromised. Here, each state in India is equivalent to 10 states in the US, and no such press release comes out when state elections happen. So, in fact, it's not just limited to Facebook. All these platforms, they are far more far more upfront about what efforts they are making when it comes to elections in first world countries. Whereas in case of Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, no such thing is happening. And the other thing that is happening in EU and in the US and even countries like Singapore, etc., there's a lot of questioning the big tech at the highest level in the parliaments, the representatives of these companies, including people like Zuckerberg, and all of them have had to appear before various parliaments to answer questions which have been posed of the platform. Not once has that happened in India, despite India being the second largest or very often the largest market for these platforms in terms of sheer volume. So the reason why they are not being held accountable is because at this point of time, it goes in favor of the government if they're not being held accountable, because most of the weaponization of these platforms is being done by people by people who are by people from BJP at this point of time, or supporters of BJP. So there's but it goes beyond that. It is not, in general. So, for example, the biggest pattern in terms of misinformation in India is use of misleading images and misleading videos. Now, this is a very simple problem, in my opinion. I have been a software engineer for 15 years. This is a simple issue, rather the simpler of the issues to solve. That is, if there's an image on Facebook, which is an old image. Now, Facebook being a platform which has been around for more than 10 years, that same image would have been uploaded in the past on Facebook. So it is very easy for Facebook to determine whether a certain image is old or not. Same for video. Now that constitutes, in my opinion, 60% of the misinformation. That is using an old image or video for in the present context. Now, this is something that automation can do. You don't have to depend on fact checkers. All you have to say is that this image is at least 3 years old. This video is at least 4 years old. Now, that kind of automation has not been done, where we are not saying solve the entire issue, but break down the issue into individual problems and see what you can address first. And then, of course, there are more difficult issues which cannot be addressed through technology, where fact checkers can come into picture. But being a technology platform, when certain issues can be solved through technology, and their failure to do so also shows that very often what they're doing is just to get those PR points. At the end of the day, the business model of these organizations, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, they earn money by ensuring maximum time, that users spend maximum of time on the platform. And if the boring old content doesn't work, you need clickbait content, etc. And that is when people spend more and more time on these platforms. So increasingly, I feel that, in fact, this is what I felt for the longest time, that their business model is one which will never allow them to fix their platforms.
Obfuscation of reality is something, which has been happening for ages. And obfuscation in the sense that, peddling of fake news and peddling suitable narratives. So if you look at the history, you look at the Great Depression, where happy faces were floated on, printing platforms, newspapers, to counter the reality. So the larger question is how fake news diverts public attention from real issues and accountability.
We make a lot of comparisons with what was happening earlier. We constantly saying that politicians have always been lying and all of that. Yes, all of that is true, but we discount the scale at which it is happening today. 20 years ago, when you had to, when was the peak time for propaganda? When an election is approaching, and then the politicians and the political workers, they go from door to door, they do election campaigning, they print pamphlets, etc. And this was a very labor capital intensive process, which was happening once every now and then, before elections, etc. Now, what you see is that propaganda, every little issue, the narrative is managed. So let's say farmers protest, let's say anti-CA and RC protest, every single issue, the narrative is managed, and the propaganda happens 24/7. So while you know, misinformation was used by Nazis, misinformation was used in all the time, but the scale at which it is happening right now with social media coming into picture is a different scale altogether. We are completely overwhelmed by propaganda, and I constantly see that people are unable to differentiate between what is authentic, what is inauthentic.
Dr. Camilla, another important data is about how 77% of the respondents in India said that they trusted the news media in general. Your opinion on this and what were the key findings here?
I would say that there is probably, I mean, I think it's a finding that it's a bit hard to explain because first, because the levels are pretty different from the other three countries. The levels of trusting news in India are, in general, are higher than in the other three countries, and I think it might be a trait of what people have in mind when they are responding this question. It's a broad question about how much they trust the information that they get from the news media in India. So they might have in mind the things that they use more often, or they might, on the other side, have in mind the news organizations that they don't like, and then they respond accordingly. So I would say it's we need to break down a bit these results to have a better understanding of that. And when we do, what we find is that usually younger people that are more educated and more interested in politics are the groups in India that tend to trust the news more. Also, I think we have the political element that is very important of supporters of the BJP or Prime Minister Modi tending to trust the media more, and we addressed a bit that it might have to do with the fact that they feel that most of the coverage probably fulfill their needs, and they might be not necessarily the most relevant ones from a public interest perspective, but when they are responding, that's maybe what they have in mind. And I think we can also make some differentiations according to topics people have in mind when they are asked about this. When we ask about trusting news in general, we are not specifying if they are talking about their local news or if they are talking about news about the economy, about COVID, about politics. And when we try to do this differentiation and actually uh, ask about specific topics, we see different levels of people having of different levels of interest about different kinds of news, and this happens in India and the other countries, and in general, lower levels of trust when it is about politics, and this is also true for India. So when we talk about specific about politics and news about politics, people tend to trust it less than they do when we are talking about general trusting news. So I think there is although this question is very useful to have an overview of how people in the four countries think about their levels of trust in general. I think it needs to be a bit more detailed to be able to explain which groups are we talking about and what nuance we have there.
Your last comment I'd want to know is how do you think, at academics as somebody like you can, inculcate and spread the message of responsible online behavior or digital literacy?
I think there are NGOs and there are some civil society organizations that are focusing in these kinds of things, and they have different levels of success. And I think this is also a responsibility for news organizations in the sense of trying to get closer to specific groups that tend to be less trustworthy but are not necessarily hostile and can be conquered and can have a reference of what good news is. I think one thing that we have been seeing in this project so far is that although there are groups of people, especially the most politically interested, the politically engaged ones, that have very strong views about the news act accordingly and tend to be more and tend to be harder to convince. There are also groups that feel disconnected from news because sometimes they don't see the value, and news organizations are not good enough in explaining why the product that they are offering is better than what they could get anywhere else. So I think there is a space for groups that are disconnected from news but are not necessarily hostile to be conquered and to create a more established and a more enduring relationship with news organizations that offer trustworthy news and that can be and that could be um, seen as reliable sources for people that are interested in just being better equipped to make decisions about their lives. I think this is a very important goal.
Pratik, last question, last comment. In your opinion, how do you think we can take it forward, and how can we promote responsible online behavior and increase more of digital literacy?
I think three things need to be done from an Indian perspective. Number one, in India, education is a federal as well as a state subject. At least the states can start working on the issue of digital literacy. What we are seeing, the because of lack of digital literacy, the issue is not just one of disinformation, but what is happening is online frauds, financial frauds, with aged people losing money, with people in rural areas being duped in name of jobs and name of opportunities through online advertisements, false online advertisements. Right now, there is also an issue going on in India where there are these apps which claim to give money, and they are defrauding people, give short-term loans. So the lack of digital literacy is causing harms at multiple level beyond disinformation. So it is in the interest of different states to start digital literacy programs, not just to counter the issue of disinformation, but also people losing money to such online frauds. That is number one. Number two, what needs to be done is that in India, regional, local language outlets have, while English language outlets have largely acknowledged that the issue of disinformation exists, but what is more important is for the local language outlets to at least have one weekly column or a show on the TV where you don't have to do it every day. Do it once a week, where you keep telling people that, look, these were the major sort of instances of misinformation in this week. When you do that repeatedly, then people know that, oh, this is what I saw on WhatsApp yesterday, this was false. And if you do it 10 times, 20 times, that is when you start building some amount of critical thought in the society. And number three, again, the state governments, especially, I would say those who are not being directly benefited by this kind of propaganda, they have to start making the big tech accountable. That is, they have to start asking them questions, asking them to tell us why hate speech is not being deplatformed, asking them why repeat offenders are not being deplatformed, asking them why the fact-checking policy is failing, where, again, repeat offenders are not being fact-checked. There are many, many questions to be asked. So this could be the three-pronged approach that I can suggest for now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Camila. Thank you, Pratik, for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Subscribe to Midday India. Get direct notifications on all our videos by clicking on the bell icon.